First of all, I want to start with that innovation is more of an art than a science. It takes practice, and it has a lot of tools developed over the years. You can innovate products, you can innovate services, you can innovate systems, and as you go up that ladder, it gets more and more complex, and I think you're looking somewhere between a service and a system innovation. I've worked across those three over the last 30 years, and I've looked for more complexity, but four main things has always been the same. I think two of them you have already covered in your material. You should be inspired by external things, either analogies, new technologies, and again, being an art, what you need to do in art, you need a canvas that is ideally white, so you can innovate, and you need inspiration. So inspiration comes from the external, as well as number two, from the user. And I was just struck by the statistic that was on the little video. I think the inspiration on the user and understanding the needs is not talking to your existing clients. If you have only 1 out of 4, you should actually understand the other 3. And the design industry and the design practice in innovation is not just doing focus group, it's actually walking in their shoes by following them, observing them, understanding that. So that's kind of from an inspiration external and from the user. The other two, I think, is how you go about it. And I think we heard about this as well already. I've always worked with a team. It's very hard to do innovation individually, and ideally with a very diverse team from a thinking and a background point of view. I know not much about the law, but I've thought about giving you some ideas that might to try on. We are in Silicon Valley. Venture capital firms are very good at getting artists in residence, entrepreneurs in residence, design in residence. How many law firms use something like that to actually get different thinking within your organization? And then the last one that I actually think is the most secret tool is the idea of backcasting rather than forecasting. And I'll explain that a little bit. Normally, when you have a problem, you're looking for the solution in a linear way. And to a certain extent, you then go about it incrementally. You only have the degrees of freedom you have today because you're working from where you are today and trying to figure out how you can change it. The idea of backcasting is that you free yourself from all your current constraints. And I think it was also in one of the video, design the legal system as it could be. You're not going to deliver it, but it's about really getting good inspiration. And then when you have that line of sight, something that really is exciting, then you cast back, and then you make an incremental step towards that destination. And that incremental step is going to be just a little bit harder than the one if you would innovate incrementally. But if you make one step and one step on top of each other, in 5 to 10 years, you get much further. So the idea, I think, of backcasting and having an inspirational line of sight is probably the most important.
Well, Judith.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I normally never brag about my education, but today I think it's appropriate. I'm a Stanford Law alumni, so I'm very, very happy to be here. And this is a school where I learn what lawyers can do for innovation. I'm basically very thankful for everything I learned at Stanford, so very happy to be here. So you might wonder why Doctors Without Borders will send somebody like me to speak at a conference like this. When Doctors Without Borders doesn't hire many lawyers. I think we're like a few lawyers in the organization, maybe less than 10 globally, of around 30,000 staff. My work really fits within a mini team within Doctors Without Borders that works on technologies and technological innovation, and how to basically create strategies, legal policy strategies, to enhance access to new technologies for the countries where we work, including technologies like medicines and vaccines, but not only medical technologies in the pharmaceutical sector. So Doctors Without Borders tries to innovate every day in the work we do. We are still learning how to innovate. Is an aspiration, not a realization yet. But some of the work we do is trying to basically change the rules of the game for innovation, changing the design of the innovation system to ensure that any outcomes of the innovation systems are going to be available to many people as possible and are going to be also adapted to the resource poor settings where we work. So just to give you an example of one of the pieces of work that we're currently doing, vaccines. There's a lot of vaccines being developed for children living in the United States and in Europe, and these are game changers innovation. They really prevent a lot of diseases, and we want them. Our doctors really want them. But many of these vaccines have very cold chain requirements. Basically, you have to use, you have to have electricity. You have to use a lot of high level of constraints to really deploy them in some of the operations where we are currently working. Just to give you an example, a refugee camp in South Sudan or in Kenya, it's a little bit difficult to really maintain the cold chain. It is also quite expensive. Some of these vaccines, especially the new ones and the ones that work the best, the ones that save more lives, are very expensive. So that's also a challenge, how MSF, but also in general, the ministers of health of poor countries like South Sudan can afford these technologies. And how donors are going to feel that this is something worth investing on. I mean, how do we create an appetite for making a children in developing country become your priority if your vaccine package is very expensive? So what we've been doing and what we do is work within the legal profession, so with a team of lawyers, but also with doctors, economists, public health experts, pharmacists, so in a multidisciplinary environment to change the norms and the policies that design innovation, the innovation system for pharmaceuticals. So that's one example of some of the pieces of the work that we do that has a relationship with innovation. Another piece of the work that it's not within Doctors Without Borders, but that I was involved a few years ago, and that I think it's an important piece of the work, is it's very related, is this idea of how do we create more strategies from a legal perspective to enhance access to knowledge goods in general. So one other type of a knowledge good that is not a medicine is books, for example. We all need books. If you are living in a developing country, a book is one of the best tools you can have to really progress and knowledge in general to really get out of the situation where you live and really develop your education, your professional career. So how do we create strategies to really increase access to written material and books in developing countries? And on that field, we work a lot on copyright law and how copyright law can be an enabler or a hinder for that distribution of knowledge. And a subsection of that is books for blind people, for example. There is very little knowledge goods being produced that are adapted to people who are blind or have other kind of written disabilities. So one piece of work that I'm very proud to have been contributed was the negotiation of an international treaty at the World Intellectual Property Organization that really created a legal framework to accelerate translation of written materials for people who are blind or have other disabilities. So this framework of innovation to translate knowledge goods into materials and knowledge that is more accessible for people around the world, but especially people with special needs and challenges is some of the work that we're doing. So that's basically where I come from a very pure public interest perspective on trying to create strategies as a lawyer, working with others to enhance access to knowledge.
Both Dennis and Judith, in a second, I'm going to come back because I want to get more in the weeds and follow up with some of the things you said. But I do have the same initial question for you as well, Ron, in terms of your world outside of a legal profession. Talk to us about innovation, what you've been involved in, what you've overseen, any aspect of it.
Well, I have been working with the legal profession, but it's coming at it from an engineering perspective. So I've been kind of shocked sometimes at the cultural differences. I actually recently gave a talk to the computer science department at Notre Dame and put up a slide on the differences between engineering and law, and it was just kind of funny about the way that you get compensated or how there's free food or not, or just a lot of... I went to work at Google for years in flip-flops and brought my dog, and you don't go to work at Wilson Sonsini that way. So, but the innovation that I'm looking at has to do with the startups and looking to see across the spectrum where those startups are looking able to get success, for example, with consumer law. whether they're able to get traction with courts, big law, et cetera. And there's dispute resolution, there's document automation, there's prediction and analysis. I mean, we know about some of this, but then to look to the venture capitalists to see what they're willing to fund or not. And one of them recently said to me that they don't want to continue to invest in law because it's too hard the sales cycle is too hard. So then we look to see why the sales cycle is so hard. And I don't want to jump the gun on some of your questions, so I'll get to some of this later. So I think we're going to be getting to some of the barriers. So I'll hold off on that. So another thing that I'm trying to do is to teach lawyers how to work better with engineers. So this class that I'm teaching at Notre Dame on legal technology and informatics, so far is really trying to introduce students to the concepts of looking at law from an information perspective, the data flow, and how, I guess, and to get a notion that the predictability that we want in the substantive law doesn't have to translate to that same level of predictability in the implementation. And to try to separate out the fact that we can do really new things, we just need to know what the law requires of these systems and then remap them, which is what kind of engineers would want to do all the time. So I'm moving that forward to actually building up, hopefully in the next year, to do teams with computer science students and law students, and then doing projects, and some of this is already going on. Call out to Ron Stout and some of the work that he's doing for the Apps for Justice and stuff to get students really to start building things in Neota Logic, et cetera. The last thing is looking underneath the hood at, if you ask why there are these barriers, before I start talking about what they are, ultimately I get led to the fact that we're not really running on quality metrics.
Say that again. Quality
metrics. We don't measure quality. And that is the topic that comes up, whether it's in access to justice, consumer law, corporate law. Corporate general counsel want to measure the return on investment, and they want to be able to see which law firms or new entrants are able to offer services. And right now it's kind of based on reputation or pedigree as a placeholder for quality because we're not actually measuring the quality directly. Medicine has moved towards empirical work quite a lot, and we look at outcomes. The final outcome of litigation is one metric, but it doesn't tell you anything about the work product as we go through the process. And also, if you look at something like estate planning, outcome is not helpful because it's way too late in the game. But that's true for any number of pieces of work that we look at. So when you start asking the question, people have complained, recently came up at the ABA's UPL class that we just had in Chicago. I was on a panel on UPL and technology. And the issue is, it's not fair to say that the software doesn't produce good quality when we're not measuring the quality of the lawyer's work. We have to be able to make that comparison, and running on no data and then saying because we don't have data means we can't roll out some of these systems, blocks these systems from people that need the work. No data isn't fair to the people, or saying, well, you need to have a lawyer when they can't afford it and there's not the services available to give it to them. So that's when you look at an access problem, measurements help. When you look at corporate law, measurements matter. When you're looking at consumer law, again. So what I've been doing is blogging a lot now on metrics and showing some examples. It takes too long to go through the law review cycle. So I'm just putting stuff out there, looking at how measurements work and giving some examples of, within litigation, how do we actively measure work product? What does a good contract actually mean, and where will we get some numbers out of that? So,
well, I think that one of the constraints, if you will, for the law profession is our inherent conservatism. I graduated early 80s from law school, and the needle hasn't moved a whole much in terms of moving away from being very conservative as an industry. One quick example of that, and it's not really our subject for today, but I'm an enormous proponent of cameras in the courtroom. Always have been from day one. Virtually every state in the union allows cameras in one form or another. Federal system, not at the trial level. Ninth Circuit allows streaming of oral argument. The Supremes, no way, Jose, because they find it's beneath them. Those are my words, not the justices. But in the next breath, you'll have a justice on TV hawking his latest book. I have trouble wrapping my head around that. But as that is our predicate with an inherently conservative industry, I had a question for you, Dennis, okay? Because you had a tour of duty with McDonald's, all right? And I know you had some interesting stories to share with regard to what you did in the way of innovation at McDonald's, and I'd like you to share some of that with our audience right now.
So I'm now at Harvard doing a fellowship, but before that I was the VP of Design and Innovation globally for McDonald's, so focusing on the customer experience and service, so anything to do except food. I hope you're not insulted, but I think there's some comparisons between McDonald's and the law profession.
Supersize it, baby. Supersize it.
Yeah, that might be a solution. But actually, you're already doing that, I think, in the law based on my lawyer's bills. Sorry. I think the challenge is I've been there 13 years before I had worked at Procter & Gamble, and before that, actually, a startup. So when I arrived at McDonald's 13 years ago, what I encountered, and the way I described it, is that McDonald's was utility. And it was protected because of its ubiquity. So when changes happened with the consumer, we didn't see it that quickly on the sales side. I think the law is a little bit similar. You have a lot of protection. You have because of regulation, and therefore you have your existing business, and the world is changing around you, and you're not instantly seeing the consequences of this. To McDonald's right now, if you followed in the press, is now suddenly seeing the consequences, and it came kind of in a rush, very unexpected. So I think one of the challenges is that you have to don't believe the revenue numbers, whatever that quantity, and really look more at satisfaction and finding the right quality measures that can be leading indicators, not lagging indicators, because the number of business you bring in is a lagging indicator. A leading indicator is what's your reach and how it satisfies users. The second big one is I call orthodoxies. Every successful organization, business have orthodoxies, and actually they come from a good place originally. They are actually best practices that have established and allowed you to replicate. McDonald's has 35,000 restaurants. I don't know how many law firms and courts there are. Law has the same thing. You need a lot of best practices because you're duplicating at the retail level all over. Over time, though, these best practices actually turn into orthodoxies. They become ossified best practices because they were developed when the context was very different. So in order to do and lead innovation at McDonald's, what we had to do is break those orthodoxies and actually overturn them and ask us the question, how would we do this if we wouldn't believe that this needs to be true? So to an extent overturning the orthodoxy and smashing it together with kind of the facts on changes in the environment and the user. I think that's a method that perhaps could also be helpful to the law profession.
All right. Judith, you were touching on the issue of the vaccines and access to books. In those two specific endeavors, was there something unique that worked? And by the way, also maybe that didn't work that you think may be applicable or relevant to our goal with our summit today, and to improve access to legal services?
Yeah, and I totally, it was really resonating what you were saying, because in general, if you want to increase access to knowledge goods, being a vaccine, an HIV/AIDS medicine, or a book, a knowledge good, for developing countries, you need to question the status quo. You need to question the system and think if the system is delivering, and in this case it's not. So you need to rethink the rules. And as a lawyer, you need to be very ready to ask questions about the structure of the system. What has really helped, I think, in this field, the successes that we had, the little successes we had on some of these issues have been to really work multidisciplinary with non-lawyers, because many of the creative thinking for me has been working with economists, engineers, the innovators themselves, the people who are doing the research and development, the scientists, the doctors that are implementing the drugs and the vaccines in the field. So really working and trying to question the system and ask that question, if it's not working, how can we redesign it? And I do really have to say that I have seen that conservatism in the legal profession. There's not many lawyers. I do a lot of work, for example, on the Hill in Washington, D.C. It's members of Congress. And there's a lot of lawyers in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of lawyers also, I do quite a lot of work right now. I'm going to the World Health Assembly in Geneva, and many of the governments are represented by lawyers.
You're going to Geneva?
Yes.
Can I go?
Of course. Come with me. There's very good cheese. There's a lot of lawyers that represent the delegations of these governments that are negotiating rules and resolutions that will govern global health internationally. In the Hill, the rules that will design the innovation system for the United States, so the intellectual property rules, the trade rules. There is a lot of lawyers, and I will say 9 out of 10 are trying to maintain the system and the status quo, and it's a challenge because there's very few that are really questioning if the system is delivering, especially for consumers and for patients and for people that are underprivileged or that are not receiving the fruits of this innovation system at a technological level. So some of the most creative thinking really for me has come from working with my colleagues that are coming from other professions, and then the lawyers can be of help, but the difficult questions in reformulating the rules, but the difficult questions and the really questioning in the system unfortunately has not really come in my very limited experience from the legal profession.
Ron, I wanted to follow up on something you said right now. I'm going to characterize as follows. You were talking about we need to teach lawyers to work better with engineers. Perhaps phrased another way is lawyers need to learn to play better in the sandbox with others. Can you flesh that out for me? Because I find that intriguing. Because lawyers, God bless them, I think, we don't necessarily always work well with people outside our industry. One quick example of that, I have a white-collar boutique practice in Pasadena, California, and it never ceases to amaze me. To this day, you'll have a high-profile client, and you'll have a lawyer, and then you read in the LA Times when the reporter reaches out to the big law partner who's representing the white-collar client, whether it's an entity or an individual, and all they'll say is no comment. Now, I'm a huge advocate of that lawyer needs to bring in a public relations firm and work as a team. And lawyers at times are loath to do this, but I just wanted your thoughts on what we can be doing better to play more effectively, efficiently in the sandbox.
Well, I'll give an example. As I saw one of the startups I work with talking to an engineering team, and they kept talking about this thing, Bates number, Bates number, Bates number. And the engineers were just kind of looking. And I finally just said, that's a unique identifier. And they're like, oh, okay, got that down. And that is the simplest example of the misunderstanding, but that maps out as you increase the complexity of what you're trying to resolve, where like engineers making assumptions about the hierarchy of the court system and not understanding that you can have state and federal issues or you can remove. So you're picking a data structure based on your assumption of what courts are. And the lawyers don't understand that lawyers are looking at information from the substantive component rather than the structural component, and the engineers want to understand the structural component, and the lawyers aren't used to explaining it that way. Because a unique identifier, for example, says something to the engineer about what they're building. So that's why kind of getting these teams together, and I would actually love to see the development of legal informatics in the way that we have medical informatics as programs that we're teaching people, because as we move towards increased automation and we move towards different metrics of quality and we move towards actually a much broader range of legal services, we're going to more and more depend on these systems. So that informatics knowledge is crucial. Is that?
No, okay. Well, and let me have you continue speaking right now, because I want to segue to a different topic and have you launch it for us. And that is as follows. Just by a show of hands, number of non-lawyers that are with us today. All right. Thank you. As lawyers, we are trained in a certain way. Generally 3 years of law school, case study method, Socratic method, learn to think analytically, etc. This is a question for all three panelists, and Ron, I'll have you kick it off. But what do you think we need to change that up to some degree to make our profession, the legal profession, more open and receptive to innovative thinking? Ron, what do you think? And if you want to pass,
it's more like where to start on that one. But I don't know if we're getting into some of the barriers issues, or
let's do that.
We have an ecosystem of barriers, and there is no single problem. There's the problem with the court system is different than the problem with big law, and it's different than the problem with the legal aid clinics. But the ecosystem has developed around the lawyer-centric, kind of human-heavy work, and that now creates like its own weight. And yeah, so I looked at. Let me take an example of courts. With California courts, and they spent, I think, $250 million trying to bring in technology and then dropped it because it was a failure. So they redid their strategy recently. And some of the feedback that I gave, because it was open for public comment, I think 2 people commented. So that's already a problem. And then some of the feedback that I was giving in terms of the accountability structure of the IT staff within the court hierarchy. Because if you can't tell somebody what they need to work on, they won't do it. I mean, it's not that they're bad, they're just doing other things. That's an impediment to progress in the court system. If you don't start adopting standards, I don't know why we're still producing court opinions that don't have XML markup across the board of every single opinion. That's not that hard. But I can't quite figure out how to make that happen. So we have standards for XML, like OASIS, et cetera. Why aren't contracts marked up? We spend so much time in all of these startups looking at the syntax of a contract, which would be nothing if we put the markers in XML in the documents so that we could just pull that information out right away. And it takes a fraction of the time to put it in when you're creating the document as it does when you're trying to figure out after the fact, trying to extract a named entity. Why are we doing this? When we could just tag up, this is a big...
I agree. God bless you. I agree.
Big law, the issues are the evolution of... Everybody talks about the billable hour. It isn't just a billable hour. A partnership model creates this annual payout so that what in a corporation might go to dividends. I've written about some of this. What would go to dividends as shareholders versus managers? So why are we paying out every year when some of that properly should go to research and development within the firm and start building up, for example, pulling out and extracting the substantive knowledge in these experts' heads, putting them in a system through an API software that the clients can then query to get the information they want on like a micro level without having to go to the $1,000 an hour billable something. But there's no incentive for the partners to do this until the general counsel starts putting pressure on them, which is just starting to happen. And I'm involved in some of this, again, measuring ROI and now pushing efficiency into the system. But the problem is, if we just care about efficiency, we would resolve disputes with a coin toss. That's not what we're after. and the monkey method of writing briefs. But we need to balance efficiency and quality and know what the value is that we're producing. And to get the incentives into the courts or into, I would argue that the consumer law, whether it's like LegalZoom, Rocket Lawyer, et cetera, they're very much concerned about the quality of their product. The new entrants that are trying to do, for example, e-discovery, care very much about measuring what they're doing, and they have to go and compete with other firms. And until we have an apples-to-apples comparison, a benchmark, a standard, it's hard to go and argue that what you're producing is higher quality or the same quality at a fraction of the cost. So everybody should read Innovator's Dilemma. It's just a given.
Well, you make some extraordinary points. Judith, either in the category of do we need to change up the way we train our lawyers or barriers? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, so I was very privileged because I studied here and I had a lot of good opportunities to really interact with non-lawyers. taught a lot of clinical education that I thought was very useful, very practical, hands-off education, and also has a strong public interest focus, the law school. But that's not happening in many law schools around the world. So these three components, interact with non-lawyers, make it more multidisciplinary, go to the business school. If you're interested in innovation, as I am, make sure that you don't finish your law degree with have work with innovators, working in a project with true innovators, and understand how a lawyer can be helpful or unhelpful to innovators. Make sure you, if you're interested in public interest, as I am, make sure the law school gives you tools to be able to have a career in the public interest and rechange incentives, so you're not going to be poor and never being able to pay your debts and your school debts. So how do you build a career in public interest? So that should be a priority, I think, and some schools have it, but many don't. And third, how to make sure that you get the skills that you need. So for example, one specific field that I work on, patents and patent law, they're key as a tool to promote or not promote innovation, depends how they are implemented in practice. So in my legal education, most of my 80% of my legal education, except a few classes here at Stanford, I learned how to really promote one view. In the patents are very, it depends, I mean, who teach you patent law. You become a very different patent lawyer. So there is one view of patent law that it's the main education that 80% of lawyers, patent lawyers that come from schools around the world take. But then if you're in the real world and working with innovators, you need to also learn about flexibilities within the patent laws. How do you create exceptions to patent laws when patents are a barrier to innovation? How do you create strategies to negotiate more flexibilities, legal flexibilities with the patent laws? This is not taught in my legal profession. In my legal education, I was not teach that tool, so I had to learn that by working on it. And that's a very important skill, so a technical skill that was lacking in much of my legal education. So it's a combination of, I don't know if I'm being clear, but it's a combination of some of the things that have happened in my legal education, but that are not happening for many schools around the world, and that should happen, including multidisciplinary thinking, clinical education, and public interest focus. And third and fourth is also the technical skills that sometimes you need to be a 360-degree lawyer that really promotes innovation and delivery of innovation. If you're thinking from a technological perspective, some of that is not being really taught in schools.
Just very quickly, I agree with everything that's been said. From an innovator's point of view, just teaching innovation is not good enough. That's good, but not sufficient, because though when you graduate, you go into an environment, and the environment you go in, the culture and the values of that environment is what needs to change in order to foster innovation. And the two that come to mind, again, as an outsider, is the billable hours that Ron already talked about. But the second one, what's really key to create an innovative environment is comfort with ambiguity. And the profession of law is about eliminating ambiguity. So how can you perhaps create parts within courts, within law practices, called in a business normally skunk works, where you can create a different culture, where it's all about ambiguity. And I think you mentioned a little bit about the flexibility in patent law. So I think without that, it will be very hard, even if you educate people to become innovators, if they go back into an environment that hates ambiguity and is all about billable hours, it's not going to happen.
Wow, this is very interesting. A quick anecdote in terms of the barriers that lawyers face. I was contacted just yesterday. A colleague, Big Law, needs to bring in an outside lawyer to represent an employee of one of their corporate clients because of a white-collar investigation. And then she needed to know what I was going to charge. And I said, oh, it'll be X flat fee. Deafening silence. She's a lawyer at a big law firm, and she said, well, what's your hourly? I said, I don't do hourly. Since I launched 5 years ago, I am flat fee on every white-collar matter. And I think she had a little bit of trouble wrapping her head around that, because that's not her training, that's not her milieu at her big law firm. But I want to, this ties into something that I think, Ron, you said it beautifully. What did you call it? The ecosystem of barriers? I thought that was very, very powerful. I'd like to continue following that vein. But what other barriers, for all our panelists, by the way, do you see? Because I think if we identify the barrier, perhaps we can think of a way to surmount it somehow.
At the end of the day, lawyers are just people. And when we're trying to overcome barriers, we have to look at the incentives. So I think some of the issues that had come up with Ethics 2020 had to do with, I think it was, people here know better than me, I think it was mainly small solo type firms that were really feeling threatened by some of the changes. And I think that they need to know how to migrate their business into a way that gives them a viable living. Before they're really willing to move forward, they want to know how that's going to roll out. I'm not sure there's an easy answer there, but in essence, the model is instead of spending 10 hours on one client, when we have so many potential clients that aren't getting any help, it's how to convert to 1 hour on 10 clients. The fact that the latent market is there waiting for us means we need to really, I think we have somebody from LegalZoom here, they're all over this, right? The issue is how do we, but then when we look at creating documents more inexpensively, but having lawyer review behind that to increase the pool without cutting, corporate doesn't want to stop spending money on legal, they just want to measure what they're getting back. So you could keep going on the billable hour as long as you want to, if you could somehow tell somebody that for every dollar they're spending, they're getting 100 back. They're not going to stop spending. So a lot of this just comes down to looking at the incentives around lawyers and the structure of whether it's the courts or big law. Billable hour is one thing. The partnership model often can get in the way. That's not what's going on in the legal aid clinics. In the legal aid clinics, I think Margaret Hagan has been studying some of this back corner to look at whether or not the people running the clinic have the time to pick up the technology, whether that technology is, they just want to help people. They don't know how, like the cloud-based system maybe is not easy to use enough. So then we see LSC coming out saying everybody has to get something when they leave now. Anyway.
Your last thought, and I think we have to wrap up now. I know stay on
obviously
schedule.
You want to
no, it's quite all right.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just very quick, McDonald's was grounded on democratizing food. That's what grew the whole McDonald's system under Ray Kroc. And obviously we had to continue to figure out how we stay with that, and right now as well. If you're serious about democratization, what you have to do is you have to give your users, your clients, choice, and you have to over control. You cannot keep all the control, particularly nowadays with technology. You can't keep all the control. And if you're willing to give the client choice and control, a lot of innovations will flow. It will change your model, it will make it more difficult. But I think without opening up that degree of freedom and becoming more user-centered, it will be very hard to democratize.